Well, it's been a while since we've heard from Kamala Harris, and if you've been paying attention to anything Kamala Harris has done over the past 3 years, that's not especially surprising. She has failed spectacularly at every single task she's been assigned since she became vice president, almost as if her whole job is to pretend to solve problems while actually making them worse, which I guess is basically the unofficial job of nearly everyone who's held a job in Washington at any point this century, or really for most of the century before that. As for Kamala, in 2021, for example, the White House put her in charge of managing the crisis at the border. But unbelievable as it may be, her strategy of wagging her finger at Guatemalans and telling them, do not come here, did not prove to be especially effective. A year later, the Biden administration dispatched Harris to Germany just a few weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine with the goal of seeking to avert a war, as the Los Angeles Times reported at the time. And in the end, as we know, the Russians, I guess, took one look at Kamala Harris and went into Ukraine immediately. With a track record like that, it's not hard to imagine that Muslims all over the United States are quaking in fear today. And that's because this week, the Biden administration gave the woman who somehow became vice president yet another task. And this time, her job was to announce and to lead the first ever national strategy to combat Islamophobia. Harris herself made the announcement in a video message. Watch.
Our nation was founded on the fundamental principle that all people should have the freedom to live, to worship, and to be without fear of violence or persecution. Every person has the right to live safe from violence, hate, and bigotry. And for those reasons and so many more, President Joe Biden and I have a duty not only to keep the people of our nation safe, but to condemn unequivocally and forcefully all forms of hate.
It's always a really bold message. We condemn hate. We condemn bad things. We don't like bad things and bad feelings. We're against them. Now, before we get into the whole strategy to combat Islamophobia, it's important to pause the video, I think, just to highlight what she says in the first 30 seconds of her big announcement. She says that every person has the right to live safe from violence. That part we can agree. But then she also says, live safe from bigotry and hate. Well, see, that part's not actually remotely true. And only someone like Kamala Harris could be dumb enough to think that it is true. No, you don't have the right to live safe from bigotry. And that's because other people have the freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And they're allowed to think less of you for good reasons or bad reasons or smart reasons or stupid reasons or even for racist reasons. They're allowed to. They have that right. People can be as bigoted as they want, in fact, as long as they're not committing any crimes in the process. Nobody has the right to be free from the bigoted opinions and views and attitudes of other people. That's the whole point of the First Amendment. It protects speech that you think is good. It also protects speech that you think is bad. And as everyone says, but few seem to really believe when it comes down to it, the First Amendment is really only ever needed for that latter category. If the First Amendment does not protect speech that people find abhorrent, then the First Amendment effectively protects nothing at all. But the Biden administration apparently disagrees, and now out of nowhere, they say you have a right to be safe from bigotry. Well, how will the government enforce this new right, you might ask? And what exactly qualifies as bigotry? Is it still acceptable to discriminate against white males, for example? If not, that's bad news for literally every corporation and university in the whole country. Do they have to revise all their policies overnight? I mean, is that what we're talking about? Well, we already know the answer to that question. Of course, only certain kinds of bigotry are forbidden, the kinds of bigotry that predominantly affect loyal voters of the Democratic Party. And to that end, here's Kamala Harris explaining the administration's plan to combat Islamophobia.
And today, we take another important step forward in our fight against hate. For years, Muslims in America and those perceived to be Muslim have endured a disproportionate number of hate-fueled attacks. As a result of the Hamas terrorist attack in Israel and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, we have seen an uptick in anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, anti-Semitic, and Islamophobic incidents across America, including the brutal attack of a Palestinian American woman who was Muslim and the killing of her 6-year-old son. A senseless act of violence that the Department of Justice is investigating as a hate crime. For so many people in our nation, the past few days and weeks have brought about all too familiar fears. Fears that they will be targeted, profiled, or attacked simply because of who they are, how they worship, or how they look. And so today, I am proud to announce the Biden-Harris administration will develop our nation's first national strategy to counter Islamophobia. This strategy will be a comprehensive and detailed plan to protect Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim from hate, bigotry, and violence.
Now, for an address that's intended for a domestic audience, it's all very warlike. Our fight against hate is underway, Harris says, as she sits sternly at her little desk in front of the American flag. We have a strategy that's comprehensive and detailed, she declares. On social media, Kamala Harris went further, saying, this action is the latest step forward in our work to combat a surge of hate in America. Well, hearing a sitting vice president talk like this about American citizens is unsettling, to say the least. This is the kind of language you normally hear our leaders use when they're announcing a targeted strike against terrorist cells in the Middle East. And now that language, once again, is being turned inward against American citizens. The Biden administration is on this warlike footing against its own citizens. And what could possibly justify this, you might ask? Better be something good. There better be a reason for this kind of hostility and brazen disregard for the Constitution, and in particular the First Amendment. But there's no reason for this whatsoever. The only justification that Kamala Harris provides in her speech is that she says that, number one, she says that for years there's been a disproportionate amount of hate being targeted at people perceived to be Muslim. She says that's been going on for years. And then on top of that, there's supposedly been an uptick in what she calls Islamophobic attacks in the United States since October 7th. Well, is that true? I mean, have Muslim Americans been disproportionately targeted for years? And has there been an uptick? Kamala Harris didn't provide any kind of citation. In fact, almost every single time that we hear about some group or another that's being disproportionately targeted, in nearly every case, there's no citation offered. It's just asserted, it's stated, and we're supposed to accept it. Well, in this case, I went looking to find out where this claim is coming from. And as far as I could tell, the source for this claim is the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR. And there are obviously reasons to think that CAIR might not be the most unbiased source on something like this. So I was very interested to know how exactly they determined that anti-Muslim attacks are on the rise in the United States in just the past month. Well, on CAIR's website, they provide this explanation, quote, "The Council on American Islamic Relations, the nation's largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization, today said that it has received 774 complaints, including reported bias incidents since the escalation of violence in Israel and Palestine on October 7th. You know, that's supposedly more complaints than they normally receive in similar time periods, they say. Now, to be clear, these are not reported crimes or documented arrests, much less are they, for the most part, violent attacks or anything close to that. This statistic is based on reports that somehow get filtered to CAIR. These are complaints. So the actual headline, if you care about being honest and accurate, is that there has been an uptick in complaints. Complaints are on the rise. Well, are the complaints true? Are the complaints complaining about actual incidents of bigotry? And what qualifies as an incident of bigotry? On that last question, we might be able to come up with some kind of answer. There have been, after all, some more widely reported incidents of alleged Islamophobic bigotry. One of those reports, according to CAIR, involved, quote, a man who reportedly drove his truck through and brandished weapons against pro-Palestine protesters in Minnesota. Well, that sounds pretty bad. It sounds hateful even. So I looked into that incident a little bit more, and here's the video of what happened, which CAIR actually provides the link to. And here's what happens. Watch.
I'm right here. I know.
So that changes things a little bit. For one thing, there was no truck involved in this incident. It's clearly a sedan, what looks like a Ford Fusion. Just semantics, but if we care about being accurate. And it's obvious from the footage that the mob of so-called pro-Palestine protesters were blocking the street. They were standing in the middle of the intersection, just blocking off the intersection, which they have no authority to do. I know that leftist protesters do this all the time, and I don't know if people assume that they have legal authority to do it. They don't. Actually, it turns out that just because you have some cause that you care about, that doesn't give you the authority to just shut down traffic whenever you feel like it. And so the man attempts to continue on his way. The mob surrounds the car, starts banging on the windshield, kicking the car, and going crazy. And by the way, at this point, they've surrounded the entire car so that no matter where the guy goes, he's going to be running into protesters. Right? If you don't want to be run into, don't surround every escape route. There are people around it. There's nowhere he can go. What is he supposed to do? Just offer himself up to the mob to be torn to pieces? Now, even if you think the driver was in the wrong somehow, which he wasn't, there's also no indication that he hates Muslims. If anything, he seems to hate protesters who block traffic. And that is a form of bigotry that nearly everyone can relate to. Now, according to a blogger who was on the scene, one protester complained, quote, "It was scary, honestly, because there have been protests where people run through the crowd with their vehicles and people ended up dying. And then knowing he was armed, a part of me wanted to run away, but a part of me was trying to assist everyone else in stopping this car from causing more harm too, because there's children here. There's families here." Well, here's an idea. Maybe don't take your children to the middle of the road and block traffic. Okay, maybe don't stand in an intersection with your children. But that concept is unthinkable to these protesters, apparently. And in their effort to sell this incident as Islamophobic, various left-wing activists uploaded additional footage. And in this one, we can see the man brandishing a knife after he was surrounded. Let's watch that. Okay, so they're making this guy out to be some kind of white supremacist, some kind of Islamophobic terrorist because he was driving in his car. A mob surrounded him, and he brandished a knife to defend himself. And then he quickly realized that a knife against this whole crowd, this whole mob, is not going to do much good. He gets back into the car. Didn't actually hurt anyone. And this is the kind of incident that CARE is classifying as Islamophobic. When there is no evidence at all that this guy has any Muslim, anti-Muslim bigotry, period. And in turn, the White House is using incidents like this to claim that Muslims are seeing some kind of heightened backlash, which justifies wartime footing against MAGA Republicans and all forms of quote-unquote hatred. They're also using incidents, it would appear, that are far more ambiguous and irrelevant than this. Keep in mind that, again, mere reports of biased incidents are being counted in the total. Well, what is a biased incident? There is no one single definition, and that's the point, really. It's just something, it can be whatever they want it to be. But every university in the country has its own bias incident response team. And if you go to any university website and you find their bias incident page, you'll see some kind of definition that they're all and all the definitions are very similar. And so generally, when anyone on the left talks about bias incidents, this is what they're talking about. Here's the University of Denver, for example. This is how they define it. The university defines bias incidents as any behavior that targets individuals or groups based on their actual or perceived group identities. Examples may include, but are not limited to, graffiti, harassment, jokes, direct insults, etc. The specific forms, content, motivation, intention, and impact of bias incidents vary. Jokes are included. So a bias incident is anything that someone says or does that someone else interprets as biased, which is to say that an increase in biased incident reports really doesn't mean anything at all. And if you announce ahead of time that a certain group is going to start experiencing more biased incidents, and then members of that group immediately start complaining about biased incidents, that does not indicate that there are actually more biased incidents, whatever a biased incident even is. All it indicates is that the people in that group are being encouraged to interpret incidents that way. So why exactly is the Biden administration doing this? The most benign possible explanation is that they're not planning on really doing anything. Like, this is not anything. It's just theater. And they're just trying to win some votes in swing states like Michigan by pandering to various Muslim communities by announcing a national strategy to combat Islamophobia. And if that's true, it wouldn't be the first time that the White House has done something like this. In fact, just a few months ago, the White House announced its bold new national plan to combat anti-Semitism. They pledged that it would end hatred against Jews in the United States. But if you've been seeing any of the footage from college campuses recently, you know that the White House's plan hasn't exactly accomplished much. It was all PR. So maybe the same thing is happening here with this new plan to combat Islamophobia. Maybe they're just going to record a video and release a press release and just move on. But there's reason to think that something else is going on here. You might have noticed that over the last few years, the left and the media tend to announce ahead of time that there will be a rise of a certain kind of hate crime according to current events. And then, like magic, the prophecy curiously tends to fulfill itself. And then the left uses that increase in hate to assume more power and to demonize their political opponents. We saw this during COVID. Nearly as soon as COVID made its way to the United States, Democrats, if you remember, started declaring that the worst thing about the virus is how it would lead to anti-Asian sentiment. And they started saying this right away. And then, what do you know? That uptick happened right on schedule. As ABC News reported in 2021, quote, a new study suggests that former President Donald Trump's inflammatory rhetoric around the coronavirus, which is believed to have originated in China, helped spark anti-Asian Twitter content and likely perpetuated racist attitudes. At the same time, Democrats refused to acknowledge the obvious fact that the so-called hate crime surge against Asians during COVID was almost entirely driven by black perpetrators, which is a demographic group that votes Democrat, or a demographic group which votes Democrat by a margin of 9-1. As City Journal reported, quote, blacks are responsible for 305% more violent crime against Asians than neighborhood demographics would predict, while whites and Hispanics commit significantly fewer attacks against Asians than would be expected. Now, Democrats never talked about those numbers because they didn't want to demonize one of their primary voting blocs. They constructed a narrative and they followed through with it, no matter how obviously false it was. That's how cynical these people are. But also profoundly unoriginal, which is why we're now seeing this same strategy play out all over again in exactly the same way. They're desperately hoping that their whole narrative about quote-unquote Islamophobia will manifest in reality if they just keep pushing it over and over again. And either way, they'll pretend it has manifested, whether it really has or not. But the key point is that even if you concede the left's central claim, even if you pretend it's true that we're seeing a rise in attacks on Muslims in this country, then there's still no justification for the federal government to announce a plan to police hate. Because whether it's hate against Muslims or Jews or white people or anyone else, hate itself on its own is not something the Biden administration has any authority or any ability to resolve. Hatred is an emotional state. It exists in the human heart. You cannot eliminate it even if you tried. Which is, of course, good news for liberal activists, the very people who are pushing this federal war on hate, because they're among the most hateful people on the planet. They're gleeful whenever any of their political opponents lose their jobs or even their lives. So if anyone should be jailed under some grand new plan to punish hateful people, then it's them. But you can't do that. You can't police hate. Now, if somebody commits an actual crime driven by hate, you can punish the crime. But then the fact that it was motivated by hate as opposed to some other nasty emotion is basically irrelevant, or it should be. Hate itself, the emotion, the thought, is outside the purview of the government. When the White House announces yet another war on hate, it's actually announcing a war on feelings that it thinks we shouldn't feel. The vice president is saying, there are a lot of people feeling unapproved emotions, and we're going to put a stop to that. And when you think of it that way, which is the accurate way, you see how dystopian this really is. It's also, again, impossible. They cannot stop hate, even if we agree that they should try, and we do not agree. But they can use the pretense of a war on hate to seize more control over our lives and, they hope, our minds. And of course, that's what all this is really about. Thanks for checking out this video. If you'd like to listen to my full podcast on the go, you can check out The Matt Walsh Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.